Today we're going to be looking at some of the most convoluted, complicated, or just downright funny and stupid card text printed on a Yu-Gi-Oh card. I think it goes without saying that over the years and through the evolution of card text and problem-solving card text, we've had a couple of cards that are a complete mess, kind of like this sentence, and hopefully I've included some of the worst that we have ever seen. Now some of these are going to include old erratas for cards that have thankfully been cleaned up to not be a total mess, but I think it's funny to include some of those because, well, seeing how bad some cards used to be is quite a laugh. Now, as you can imagine, there's an insane number of cards in the card pool of Yu-Gi-Oh! So I have probably missed some real gems, and if you feel there's crazier card texts out there, then do leave them in the comment section down below because I'd love to check them out and see just how terrible some of them have been over the years. And getting straight into our list for number 10, we have basically the entire Dark World archetype. Now, Dark Worlds, first of all, you need to understand that they can only get their effect when they are discarded by an effect. So if you were to trade in Grapha, for example, that doesn't actually count as a discard, even though trade-in says discard. It's just something you have to know, that you can only trigger them if they are discarded by effects and not costs. Alright, well, okay, once you've got past that hurdle, you'd think, right, fine, the PSET on this shouldn't be that complicated. But actually it is. Let me give you an example with Snow. If this card is discarded to the graveyard by a card effect, if it was discarded from your hand to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, you could target one monster and your opponent's go blah 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 blah, right? Okay, hang on, let's just stop for a second. Why does the card start off by telling you that if it's discarded to the grave by a card effect and then suddenly just switch subject? Like it just suddenly starts talking about your opponent. If it was discarded from your hand to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, how did you make this just big jump in like subject matter? It seems very bizarre. And this isn't something unique to Snow. The entire Dark World archetype is worded like this. If it's discarded to the graveyard by a card effect, if it was discarded from your hand to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect. Like, it's just really weird because what they've done is that they've given Dark Worlds two effects. Effects where if it's discarded by you and if it's discarded by your opponent. But what they've done is that they've just mashed it together into one sentence, and it just is so clunky and convoluted to read that sometimes it's kind of hard to tell which one is, giving you which. For example, Snow, if you just keep reading, it says, you can target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, add a Dark World card from your deck to your hand, and then special that target in face-up defense. It's like, why not just divide this card into two sections? If it was discarded by me and if it was discarded by my opponent. Like, why does it have to just have both of them crammed together in one sentence? And that's just one sentence, by the way. The entire effect of Snow is one sentence. I just think this makes Dark World the most terribly worded archetype in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, if there was a championship for bad archetypes, it would be Dark Worlds at the top, purely based on their card text. So next up, we have Silent Wobby. There's a few cards in the game that work like Silent Wobby, and I think most closely would be something like Santa Claus, where it basically does things based on which side of the field it's on. Now, from your hand, you can special it to your opponent's side of the field, okay? That's simple enough. The next sentence reads, when this summoned this way, you draw one card, and if you do, your opponent gains 2000 life. Now, you have to kind of think of this as the fact that this actually now belongs to your opponent. So when reading the card text for the next part of the card, you're actually applying it to them and not yourself. So they are the ones who draws the card and you're the one who gains 2000 life points. That seems pretty simple, I think, but I just feel like this could have been like maybe worded a little bit simpler or a little bit more clear, because when you first kind of read it, it seems like kind of like it's happening simultaneously. I just felt like it could have been worded a little bit better. And then the last part of this text is where it's like, I find it's just really bad, where it says the hand size limit of this card's controller becomes 3. So no, what you're doing is not looping your opponent's hand for 2 turn 1. That's like, maybe if you're a newer player, this would be like the way you'd read it perhaps. Like, hand size limit of this card becomes 3. Well, why wouldn't you just loop them for 2? Now for number 8, we have Penguin Knight. And this is one of the cards that suffers from old card text syndrome, and that basically means that problem-solving card text wasn't a thing, and the way things are worded were just completely ridiculous and terrible. The original card text of Penguin Knight from Magic Ruler says, when this card is sent directly from your deck to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, combine your graveyard cards with your own deck, shuffle them, and form a new deck. That doesn't, what? Even the next card text of Penguin Knight, released in Dark Beginning, says the same thing, basically. It's just weirdly worded, and I guess it's something that's just never been fixed. When this card is sent directly from your deck to the graveyard by an effect of a card controlled by your opponent, which, that sounds very clunky, Unite your graveyard cards and your own deck, shuffle them and form a new deck. It's just very strange that they've used the word unite to mean basically just shuffle and then form a new deck. I mean, is it now considered a brand new deck? Like, can I stop playing Penguin Knight Turbo and just play something meta? Like, because I would probably like to do that if I had this card in my deck. And for the next card, we have Reverse Trap. I think this is really funny, and I wanted to bring this up and mention it because it's very rare that erratas and problem-solving card text would actually make a card worse in understanding what it does. Now, the original card text of Reverse Trap, I feel, was pretty easy to understand. It's from Starter Deck Yu-Gi, like way back in the day, and it basically just says originally, all increases and decreases to attack and defense are reversed for the turn in which this card is activated. But if we go on to the latest card text of Reverse Trap, in Battle Pack 2 War of the Giants, first of all, the card text has doubled in size, and second of all, I feel like it's just created this weird mess where it says until the end phase, all effects that add or subtract attack or defense are reversed. And then in parentheses it says, additions now subtract and subtractions now add instead. Multiplications and divisions, including halving/doubling, are not affected. But I see what they were doing by trying to clear up the multiplication and division side of things. However, I just feel like the sentence is just clunky. Additions now subtract and subtractions now add. Multiplication divisions, including halving and doubling, are not affected. Now for the next one, we have the original card text of KOTODAMA from Magic Ruler. Now the latest card text of KOTODAMA has actually cleared this card up, and it does make a lot more sense now, but the original card text just was the most bizarre floodgate type of monster I feel like existed, and I don't know if this was ever played, but it feels like the original card text makes this card way more broken than it should be. If a card of the same name is summoned any later turn, that card is destroyed. That sounds pretty broken. So basically what it's saying, for example, I think this is how it works. I'm not sure if it worked like this back in the day, but basically, if I summon Deneb turn 1, then that's fine. If I summon Deneb turn 2, that Deneb is just instantly destroyed, I think. Because I think what this card is trying to say with the original card text is that it's basically a floodgate that stops you from ever summoning a monster with the same name more than once in an entire duel, as long as it stays face up in the field. When I first read it, I was like, oh, this card is broken in the KOTODAMA mirror match, and that's about it. But no, it seems actually pretty crazy with the original card text. Now for the next card, I want to look at Mask of Restrict. Now most of you probably recognize Mask of Restrict with its very simple and probably with some of the shortest card text in the game, neither player can tribute cards. However, back in the day in Labyrinth of Nightmare, Mask of Restrict had some of the most bizarre ways of describing a floodgate. No matter what the situation, neither player can offer any monster as a tribute. Yes, you read that correctly. No matter what the situation. It doesn't matter if it's round 2, if you're in game 3, if you're in Puerto Rico, or if you're in London. This card doesn't let you tribute. Yes, no matter what the situation. I just think that that's just the strangest way of describing a floodgate. And next we have KAISER Colosseum. This card used to be a complete ruling nightmare for a few months, and yeah, I think it's banned for its card text more than anything, but it basically reads as follows. If there is one or more monsters on the field of the controller of this card, his or her opponent cannot place a monster on the field if his or her number of monsters would exceed the number of monsters that are on the field of this card's controller. Yes, that was one sentence. That was one full complete sentence. What the fuck? It just created so many ruling issues. If I have no monsters and my opponent has one monster, am I allowed to Stormforce Erebus my opponent because now they have 0 monsters and I have 1 more? Do you know what I mean? It's just so bizarre. It's very hard to tell. What happens if I Sphere mode? Etc. etc. There's just so many weird ways that this card can go, and yeah, I'm just glad it's banned purely for the rulings. And next up we have Mystical Ref Panel. This card actually seems insane just in general because Mystic Ref Panel basically means that if your opponent desires, you draw 2 cards for free. If your opponent trade-ins, you draw 2 cards. But then it starts to get really complicated when we consider things like maybe duality. How does duality work if you ref panel that? Which actually is a legal target. Basically, I think what happens with duality is that your opponent activates it and then you reveal 3 and add 1 to your hand, and you still get to special summon, but your opponent doesn't, so that's very weird. But then you have cards of Card of Demise, for example, and that card just doesn't work with ref panel. It doesn't count. It's very strange because just the text on Mystical Ref Panel is just so bizarre because we don't see this on any other cards in the game except, you know, weird situations like this. Activate only when a spell card that targets one player is activated. First of all, how do spell cards target players? It's just something you just have to know from a mechanical point of view. It's not in the rulebook or anything. You just have to know how targeting players work. And second of all, card text never says target a player. You know, Duality doesn't say target yourself, reveal 3. Pot of Desires doesn't say target your deck and banish 10 and draw 2. There's no such thing as targeting players, like, for the most part, except until you get to this card. And I think that it's just such a badly made card because of the fact that you need to basically bring up a wiki page with a list of cards that Ref Panel works on, doesn't work on. We were considering playing this in Monarchs way back in the day. The reason for this was because if your opponent activates Pantheism in the mirror match, well, you just draw 2. That seems really broken. But then it gets really complicated with things like Tenacity of the Monarchs. Do I get the search or does my opponent get the search? Is that even a legal target? Stormforth, like, okay, like, I guess Stormforth maybe targets my opponent? I don't know. Yeah, it's just really complicated, and the fact that you have to, like, consult different documents just to know if this card works, I think is just bad design. I just think it's just terrible, terrible card text. And for the number 2 spot, we have Five-Headed Dragon. If ever in Yu-Gi-Oh! There was a perfect example of putting the cart in front of the horse, this would be it. This card just doesn't make any sense, and it's just really weird how this made it to official print. This card reads, the fusion material monsters for this card are any 5 dragon-type monsters. This monster cannot be special summoned except by fusion summon. This card does not take any battle damage and cannot be destroyed by battle with an Earth, Water, Fire, Wind, or Dark monster. In brackets at the very end, battle damage is still inflicted to players. Are you seeing the mess of this card? The first part of this card says, this card doesn't take any battle damage, and then at the very end of the text it says, battle damage is still inflicted. Does battle damage occur or not? I don't know. What the hell's going on? This card is just bizarre. I genuinely don't know if battle damage happens or not with this original print. It just makes no sense. This card doesn't take any battle damage, and then later on in the card it says battle damage is still taken. What? It's so bizarre and it's so weird, and I just think, like, how did this make it to the final card? And this is why Five-Headed Dragon original print is deserving of the number 2 spot. And before we get to number 1, I'd just like to give a big shout out to my latest patron, Travis. Thank you so much for contributing. And remember, if you guys help out on Patreon, it's a way to support me in making this amazingly terrible and generic content for you. And for number 1, we have Inspector Border. Now, I think that this is way higher up in the list than it deserves to be, just because of the fact that this is a brand new card. This is a card that came out like a month ago, and it's crazy. After all the iterations and designing of problem-solving card text and the evolution of card text, we still have Inspect Border, a complete mess of a card, and I just hate this card so much. I don't care how good you are at rulings and judging, you could be the best, like, PSCT reader in the world, and when this card first came out, I guarantee you probably had to read this like 3 or 4 times to truly wrap your head around it. Inspect Border reads, cannot be normal or specialed if you control a monster. Okay, that's the first sentence, very easy to understand. I can't summon Inspector Border if I have a monster. That's fair enough. Alright, now let's move on to the next part. Neither player can activate a monster effect unless the number of monster effects that player has previously activated that turn is less than the number of monster card types currently on the field. Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, XE, Pendulum, and Link. What the fuck? New parentheses. If an effect activation was negated, it still counts towards the total for that turn. Only count effects that were activated while this monster was face up on the field. I just think that this was the wordiest way ever to say, basically you can only activate effects equal to the number of types of monsters on the field. Right? Do you get it? Okay, so if I have 1 XE on the field, I can only activate 1 monster effect. If I have an XE and a Synchro on the field, I can activate 2 effects that turn. If I control 3 Pendulum monsters, I can activate only 1 effect. Do you get it? So it's effects equal to the number of monster types. I just feel like this could have been worded way more simply, and it just wasn't. Instead, they went with this complete mess here. And the reason this is so high up on the list is because this is supposed to be a brand new card with the pinnacle of card text in Yu-Gi-Oh! Which I feel like clearly needs to be revolutionized in somehow, because there's no way a new player can read this card and just be like, yep, I get it. So that's my top 10 list here. Again, as I said, if I missed anything crazy out, then please do leave it in the comment section down below. Tell me what you think of this list, and if you have any other suggestions, then yeah, comment, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.